She never thought it would end like this. One minute, her life was full of promises, dreams carefully built over years of love and trust. The next, she was standing alone, staring at the empty space where everything she had once called hers used to be. He had taken it all: the home they shared, the money, even the little things she thought wouldn't matter to anyone but her. The books she loved, the pictures that held memories, the furniture they had picked out together. Gone. She tried to understand. Was it punishment? A cruel game? Or had she just been blind to who he truly was all along? The questions swirled in her mind, but no answers came. Only silence. At first, she felt numb. Shock had a way of making reality feel distant, like a nightmare she would wake up from any moment. But the days passed, and the nightmare remained. Friends who once swore they would always be there for her disappeared one by one, avoiding her calls, changing the subject when she reached out. Some didn't even bother pretending. They had picked their side, and it wasn't hers. For the first time in her life, she had nothing. Nothing except the pain. But pain had a way of teaching lessons that comfort never could. And slowly, she began to see things differently. He had left her with nothing, but maybe, just maybe, that meant she had nothing left to lose. That realization changed everything. She stopped waiting for an apology that would never come. Stopped hoping for someone to save her. If she was going to rise from this, she would have to do it on her own. And so, she did. She started small. A single step, then another. It wasn't easy. There were days she wanted to give up, nights when the loneliness felt unbearable. But with every setback, she found a new reason to keep going. She worked harder than ever, pushing past the doubts, the exhaustion, the whispers of those who thought she would never make it. What they didn't know was that she wasn't just trying to survive. She was rebuilding. Stronger, wiser, unstoppable. And soon, the world would see exactly what she was capable of. Because the man who left her with nothing, he had no idea what she was about to become. She woke up the next morning in a bed that wasn't hers, in a place that barely felt like home. It was a tiny apartment, bare walls, a single worn-out chair, and a mattress on the floor. A far cry from the life she once had, the one she had built with him, the one he had ripped away without a second thought. She stared at the ceiling, the weight of reality pressing down on her chest. The past few weeks had been a blur of heartbreak, anger, and exhaustion. She had cried more than she ever had in her life, but the tears had stopped now. There was no time for that anymore. She had nothing left to lose, which meant the only direction she could go was forward. She got up, forcing herself to move, to ignore the ache in her body and the emptiness in her heart. The bills wouldn't wait for her to heal. The world wouldn't pause while she figured things out. She had to survive, even if she didn't know how. She found a job, nothing special, nothing close to what she had once dreamed of. It paid little, but it was enough to keep the lights on and food on the table. The long hours drained her, but she kept pushing. Every paycheck was a reminder that she was doing this on her own, that she didn't need him or anyone else to tell her what she was worth. But just surviving wasn't enough. Late at night, after work, she would sit in front of her laptop, researching, learning, trying to find a way to rebuild her life. She had always been passionate, always had ideas, but back then, she had been too comfortable to chase them. Now, with nothing holding her back, she started to see possibilities where she once saw limits. She took a risk. It wasn't a big one at first, just an idea, a small step into something new. She poured whatever little money she had into it, knowing that failure was a possibility, but also knowing she had no choice but to try. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. She worked harder than she ever had, balancing long shifts with sleepless nights, building something from the ground up. People doubted her. They told her it wouldn't work. Some even laughed, reminding her of where she came from, of what she had lost. But what they didn't understand was that she wasn't doing this to prove anything to them. She was doing it for herself. One day, something changed. A small breakthrough. An unexpected opportunity. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, she was onto something. She kept going, and soon the world would take notice. She barely noticed how exhausted she was anymore. The long days at work, the sleepless nights spent chasing something that still felt just out of reach. It had all become routine. She had no choice but to keep going. Giving up wasn't an option, not after everything she had already endured. Her small idea, the one she had nurtured in the quiet hours of the night, was starting to take shape. It wasn't a massive success yet, but she could feel the shift. People were beginning to notice her work. A few orders turned into a dozen. A dozen turned into more. She wasn't making a fortune, not yet, but she was making progress. And progress meant everything. But with every step forward, there were new obstacles. The first came in the form of doubt, not from herself, but from those around her. Some people still saw her as the woman who had been left with nothing, the one who had been abandoned, betrayed. They expected her to stay broken, to never fully recover. When they saw her trying to build something new, they questioned whether she was strong enough, smart enough, capable enough. She didn't have the time or energy to argue with them. Their doubts didn't matter. What mattered was proving to herself that she could do this. Then came the financial struggles. Every cent she earned seemed to disappear just as quickly into bills, supplies, rent. It was a constant balancing act, trying to keep herself afloat while still investing in her growing business. There were days she wanted to scream in frustration, nights when she stared at her dwindling bank balance and wondered if all of this was just a waste of time. But just when things seemed impossible, something unexpected happened. She received an email, a simple message from someone she didn't know, complimenting her work and asking if she would be willing to collaborate. At first, she thought it was a mistake, or maybe some kind of scam. But after doing her research, she realized the person reaching out to her was serious, and they had influence. It was an opportunity she never saw coming. But with opportunity came new challenges. She was stepping into a world she didn't fully understand yet, surrounded by people who had far more experience, more connections, more power. It would be easy to feel intimidated, to believe she didn't belong. But she had already been underestimated once. She wasn't about to let it happen again. She accepted the offer, and just like that, everything began to change. The collaboration was supposed to be a turning point. It was her chance to prove herself, to take everything she had built and push it to the next level. But success never came without complications. At first, things moved quickly. Meetings, discussions, ideas exchanged in rapid fire. The person who had reached out to her was well-connected, influential, someone who could open doors she never even knew existed. She should have been thrilled, and she was at least at first. But something felt off. The more involved she became, the more she started to realize that not everyone in this new world had good intentions. Promises were made, but not all of them were kept. Deadlines were pushed, agreements adjusted in ways that didn't quite sit right with her. People who had once seemed supportive now acted distant, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. Then came the whispers. At first, she ignored them. She had learned long ago that people would always talk, that there would always be those who wanted to see her fail. But these weren't just rumors spread by jealous outsiders. These came from people within the industry, the same people she was supposed to be working with. They said she was in over her head, that she was lucky to have been given a chance at all, that without the right people backing her, she would never make it. And then, the worst of it, she heard his name. She hadn't thought about him in months. The man who had left her with nothing. The one who had walked away as if she had never mattered, but suddenly, there he was, his presence creeping back into her life like a shadow she couldn't escape. He was part of this world, He had connections here and now. Somehow, he had found out about her success. That's when the real trouble started. Deals she had worked hard for suddenly became uncertain. People she had trusted hesitated, as if they had been warned about working with her. A project she had poured everything into was put on hold with no explanation. She knew exactly what was happening. He was trying to stop her. He had taken everything from her once before. And now, when she was finally on the edge of something bigger than she had ever dreamed, he wanted to take that too. But this time, she wasn't the same woman he had walked away from. She had fought too hard to let him win, and if he thought she would back down now, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. She knew he was pulling the strings, but what she didn't understand was why. He had walked away from her without a second thought, left her with nothing. So why now? Why, after all this time, did he care what she was doing? She wasn't about to wait for the answer to come to her. She had worked too hard to let everything slip through her fingers because of him. If he wanted a fight, he was going to get one. But just as she started pushing back, reaching out to contacts, securing new deals to replace the ones that had fallen through, something happened that she never saw coming. Someone from her past reached out. Not just anyone, but a person who had once been on his side. The message was simple: we need to talk. She hesitated. Trust wasn't something she handed out easily anymore. But curiosity, mixed with the desperate need to understand what was really happening, drove her to meet. What she learned in that conversation changed everything. It turned out that he wasn't just trying to ruin her career, he was trying to erase her completely. He had been feeding lies to the right people, twisting the truth, making her look unreliable, inexperienced, even reckless. And it was working. But that wasn't the biggest shock. The real twist? He wasn't doing it just because he wanted her to fail. He was doing it because he was scared. She had unknowingly stepped into territory he had always controlled. The success she was building wasn't just an inconvenience to him, it was a threat. And if she kept going, if she broke through the barriers he had spent years maintaining, she wouldn't just succeed. She would surpass him. And that was something he couldn't allow. The realization sent a wave of anger through her, but along with it came something else: determination. If he was this desperate to stop her, it meant she was closer than she had ever been. She was done playing defense now. It was time to take back control. She moved fast. There was no time to waste, not when she knew he was tightening his grip, pulling strings in the background to make sure she never got the chance to rise above him. But what he didn't realize was that she wasn't the same woman he had left behind. She had spent too long fighting to give up now. She started making calls, reaching out to the connections she had built, people who had seen her work ethic firsthand. Some hesitated at first, but not all. There were those who believed in her, who had watched her claw her way up from nothing, and knew she wasn't someone to be dismissed. She didn't need the approval of everyone, she just needed the right people to listen. And they did, one by one. The doors he had tried to shut began to crack open again. It wasn't easy. There were still setbacks, still whispers in the industry, trying to paint her as reckless, unqualified. But she had something he didn't: authenticity. She had built her success with her own hands, from the ground up, and no amount of manipulation could erase that. But just when she thought she was gaining control, the final blow came. He had been watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And then, he did. A lawsuit. The papers arrived at her door like a slap to the face. He was accusing her of stealing ideas, of breaking contracts she had never even signed. It was a classic tactic, dragging her name through the mud, tying her up in legal battles, so she would be too distracted, too drained to keep moving forward. For a moment, she felt the familiar weight of exhaustion, of frustration. This was what he wanted. To exhaust her, to make her doubt herself, to remind her that no matter how hard she fought, he would always be there, standing in her way. But this time, he had underestimated her. She had learned from her past mistakes, and she wasn't going to fight this battle alone. She called in reinforcements, lawyers, industry insiders, even a few powerful voices who had seen this game played before and were tired of it. And then she did something he never expected. She went public. She told her story, the full truth, from the moment he left her with nothing to the way he had tried to sabotage her every step of the way. And people listened. The industry took notice. The audience she had built, one that had admired her for her resilience, rallied behind her. His name, once powerful and respected, became tangled in controversy. People started asking questions, digging into his past, and slowly the tide began to turn. The lawsuit? Dismissed. The damage to his reputation? Irreversible. And her? She stood taller than ever, but just when it seemed like it was over, the final twist revealed itself. A former business partner of his came forward with information that changed everything. He hadn't just been trying to stop her, he had been covering up his own failures. The empire he had built was crumbling from the inside out, and she was never the real threat. His own mistakes had been catching up with him all along. She had been so focused on fighting him that she hadn't realized she had already won. And now, for the first time in a long time, she could finally move forward, free from his shadow, free from the past. This wasn't just about proving him wrong anymore. It was about proving to herself that she had been right all along. She sat in the quiet of her office, looking out over the city skyline. It still felt unreal, sometimes, how far she had come, how much had changed. Not long ago, she had been struggling just to keep her footing, constantly looking over her shoulder, bracing for the next battle. Now, the weight was gone. The fight was over. She had won. Not in the way she had originally imagined. It wasn't about destroying him, about getting revenge. That part had faded somewhere along the way. What mattered now was that she had proven herself, not to him, not to the people who doubted her, but to herself. The industry was finally seeing her for what she had always been: capable, resilient, a force in her own right. The doors that had once been slammed in her face were now wide open, not because someone had handed her an opportunity, but because she had carved out her own space. And he had faded into the background. His empire, once untouchable, had started to crumble under the weight of its own deception. The people he had manipulated for years had turned away, realizing too late that his power had always been built on illusion. The name that once carried influence now only carried whispers of what had gone wrong. She didn't need to keep track of his downfall. It didn't change anything for her. What mattered was where she was going next. The unexpected part was how much support she had gained along the way. People she had never expected, former competitors, influential voices in the industry, even complete strangers who had followed her journey, were reaching out, wanting to work with her, to be part of what she was building. She wasn't just proving herself anymore. She was changing the game. She thought about the person she had been before all of this, the woman who had been left with nothing, wondering how she would survive. If she could go back and tell herself anything, it wouldn't be about what was coming, about the struggles or betrayals. She would tell herself one simple truth. She was always going to be more than what he left behind. The past didn't define her. He didn't define her. She had built herself from the ground up, and now the world was finally seeing her for who she truly was. Not a victim, not someone trying to prove her worth, but someone who had always been worth more than he could ever imagine. And this was just the beginning.